was starting to fall harder now, and the two boys knew they had to find some kind of shelter. They were lost in a part of the woods they had never seen before, and still couldn't believe they had gotten separated from the other campers. Now they understood why the camp counselors always told them to stick together and not to wander off from the group. By now, it had gotten so dark, the only way the boys could see was when the lightning flashed across the sky. It was during one of those bright flashes that they spotted a little shack tucked away deep in the woods. They ran through the rain and darkness until they reached the door. They knocked loudly, and when no one answered, they went inside. It was a small, one-room shack with a fireplace in the corner. And in the room, there was only one bed, a small table, and one old chair. The boys found some wood by the fireplace and started a nice, warm fire. They needed to dry their clothes and wanted to take the chill out of the night. As the fire grew brighter, the boys suddenly noticed there was a scraggly black cat sitting in the old chair. They could tell there was something very strange about this cat. And as they looked closer, they realized the cat had no eyes, just holes where its eyes had once been. Well, if it had not been such a nasty rainy night, the boys surely would have thrown that eerie black cat out. But as it was, they would just try to ignore it. For they had decided to stay where they were and wait until morning to find their way back to camp. As they began settling down for the night, one of the boys noticed a small bowl sitting on the table by the bed. And in the bowl sat two small, round objects. At first, he thought he had found some pieces of fruit, and since he was very hungry, he decided to pick up one of the pieces and see if it was edible. As he got the object closer to his mouth, he realized that this was no piece of fruit. In his hand, staring right up at him, was a human eyeball. He quickly dropped the eye back into the bowl, grabbed the bowl, and threw the eyes into the fire. He stood there shaking for a few moments, and then began explaining to his friend what had happened. This place seems like a bad dream, they thought. But they also knew they both needed some rest. So they laid down and quietly drifted off to sleep. Sometime later that night, right before dawn, the boys were awakened by a strange noise. They could see that the door was half open. And then, over in the corner, they saw her. An ugly old woman. She was kneeled down in front of the cat and appeared to be stroking it. When suddenly, to the boys' disbelief, she reached up, plucked out her eyes, and put them back into the cat's head. Then she creeped across the room and picked up the bowl. And when she found it was empty, she raised back her head and screamed out, "Who took my eyes? Who took my eyes?" At this point, the boys had seen enough. They ran out the door and ran through the woods as fast and as far away as they could, never slowing down and never stopping to look back. You see, every night, this old witch would take out her eyes and put them in the bowl. Then she would borrow the black cat's eyes so she could walk through the night with the eyes of a cat. Now, since that old witch's eyes burned in the fire, all I can think of is that she's still out there someplace, looking for someone else's eyes to replace hers. So my advice to you is, you'd better be very, very careful that late one night, as you lay there sleeping, she doesn't pay you a visit and pluck out your eyes. One of the most, if not the most important tool for the camper is the flashlight. For when the daylight gives way to the night, and you find yourself alone in your bed, the flashlight is the only protection you have against the night, and of course, the creatures of the night. Late one evening, Susan lay restless in her bed. All of her bunkmates were sound asleep, so there was nothing for her to do except listen to the sounds of the night. As she lay there listening, she began thinking of how peaceful the night could be, and soon found herself drifting off to sleep, only to be awakened by a sound she had never heard before. She quickly sat up in her bed and started looking out the window, wondering what could have made that awful sound. But there was nothing to see. Just the moon, the clouds, and the darkness. Then, something caught her eye. There were two small reddish lights moving through the woods. They looked like the eyes of some wild animal, but it was too dark to tell. She kept watching these strange lights until all at once they disappeared. She was beginning to wonder if it was only her eyes playing some kind of trick on her. Then, out of nowhere, they reappeared. But this time, they had moved out of the woods and into the clearing, much closer to her cabin. She reached down to grab her flashlight, and at that very moment, remembered she had left it at home. She tried to wake up her friend, but couldn't make her move. Just then, the moon burst through the clouds, and for the first time, she could see a figure. It looked like a man, but yet it didn't. Its eyes were glowing red, and it seemed to be running, slightly hunched over. It was moving right towards her. Susan was so terrified. She jumped back into her bed and pulled her sleeping bag up over her head. For some reason, she felt this would protect her. She lay there too scared to move, hearing only the sound of her own heart beating. After a few quiet moments, Susan decided she had to look. She had to know where this creature was. She eased out of her sleeping bag and slowly stood up. She leaned over toward the window and put her trembling hands on the window ledge. She pressed her face against the screen. And then she was staring face to face with a red-eyed creature who had long yellow teeth and skin that looked like it was about to melt from its face. The creature ripped through the screen and with its long bony fingers grabbed Susan around the neck and started pulling her through the window. She started screaming and kicking and fighting to break free. But the creature just kept pulling her closer and closer. As the other girls started stirring in the cabin, flashlights began filling the air with light. When suddenly one of those rays of light shined right into the creature's eyes. It let out a loud, painful scream, dropped Susan, and ran quickly back into the woods. Needless to say, no one ran after it. For the next few days, the local authorities searched the area. They never did find the creature. Most people think it's gone, so far back into the woods that no one will ever see it again. But me, I think it's still out there, somewhere very close by. Sometimes the night can play strange tricks on your eyes. The moon shadows can dance across the ground and make you believe you've just seen a ghost. Other times you might wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself in a cold sweat, half scared to death because you just dreamed about a ghost. And then there's always the chance that late one night you just might meet a ghost. And let me remind you, there are no age limits on who can see a ghost. In fact, the story I'm about to share with you once happened to a camp counselor at this very camp. It must have been around 2 o'clock in the morning. The night was slowly passing, and the moon had quietly risen in the sky. Bill was sleeping soundly and had no idea what was about to happen. He began feeling a hand gently nudging him. It was such a soft touch that at first he thought he was only dreaming. But the nudging continued. He finally realized he was awake, so he opened his eyes, and this is what he saw. There before him, kneeled down beside his bed, was a woman. She was pale and shivering, and her hair was soaking wet. Then he noticed that all her clothes were wet, and she must have been very cold, because not only was her skin as white as snow, her lips were purple. When Bill finally spoke, all he could say was, "What are you doing here?" The woman slowly raised her arm and pointed towards the lake. Then, in a soft, eerie voice, she whispered, "I've been walking down by the lake. I slipped and fell in. Can you help me home?" This seemed a little odd to Bill, but he told her he would be glad to help her home, and then asked her to wait for him outside. So he got up, got dressed, and grabbed his jacket. When Bill got outside, he noticed the woman was still shivering, and she was just standing there, gazing off towards the lake. He walked up to her and gave her his jacket. He told her to put it on, that it would help her warm up. She stood there silently for a moment, and then said, "We must go now. I live a few miles from here, and I need to be home before sunrise." So they got into Bill's truck and drove off down the road. After driving for a few miles, they came upon a quaint little farmhouse. The woman abruptly said, "Stop here. This is where I live." So Bill quickly stopped the truck and pulled over to the side of the road. Then the woman got out of the truck and started walking towards the house. Bill, realizing he didn't even know her name, yelled out, "What is your name?" The pale young woman stopped and turned around and said, "My name is Mary Rose." Then she continued on towards the house. Bill turned the truck around and started back to the camp. He was thinking to himself that he had met a very strange woman, but was excited about seeing her again, when he suddenly realized she still had his jacket. Not to worry, he thought, "I'll just go back and get it in the morning." The following morning, he did just that. He drove back to the house and walked up to the front door. He gently knocked and then stood back, hoping Mary would answer. Well, the door opened, and there before him stood two older adults. He figured they were Mary's parents, so he said, "Hello, my name is Bill. I let Mary borrow my jacket last night, and I forgot to get it back. Is she awake yet?" For a moment, the parents looked stunned. Then they looked at Bill and said, "Mary doesn't live here anymore." "There must be some kind of mistake," Bill said. "I drove Mary home last night, and I'm sure this is her house." Then the parents continued, "Son, we don't know what kind of joke you're trying to play, but our Mary is dead. She died 2 years ago. on this very day, in a freak boating accident over on the camp lake. Now Bill just stood there stunned. He didn't know what to say. And then he remembered his jacket. "My jacket," he said. "I gave her my jacket. Check the house. It must be in there." By now the distraught parents had heard enough. They said, "Look, son, our Mary is dead, and she's buried over there atop that hill. Just go see for yourself." And then they closed the door. Bill turned away and began walking towards his truck. But he had to know what was going on. So he quickly ran to the top of the hill, and there, just like the parents had said, was a gray marble gravestone. And written across the stone were these very words: "Here lies our sweet Mary Rose. May she rest in peace." Bill's knees became weak, and he started to tremble. For not only was Mary dead, but there, hanging on the back of the gravestone, was his jacket. Hiking is not only fun, but it's a great way to enjoy the woods. When you're out on the trail, you can experience all of nature's beauty. And everything is so peaceful and tranquil. That is, until you stumble upon the unexpected. Last year, a group of girls and boys had set out on their favorite camp activity, hiking along the river. This was the best hiking path because the river always had strange and exciting things to discover. And you never knew what would wash up along the river's edge. As the group walked along, enjoying the day, they came around a small bend in the river and stopped dead in their tracks. One of the girls had spotted something unusual. Laying there, just ahead of them, washed up on the bank, was what appeared to be a human arm. It looked like it had been severed at the shoulder, and its hand was clenched tightly in a fist, as if it were holding something. They all just stood there and stared, wondering what they should do. Should they walk closer? Or should they run back to camp? What would you do? Well, being in an adventurous spirit, they decided to walk closer. And when they did, it was just as they feared. Right before them, laying on the riverbank, was a severed human arm. And there, inside its tightly clenched fist, was a rolled-up piece of paper. "It must be some kind of note," one of the boys said. "Let's pry open the hand and get it out and read it." Not everyone agreed with this method of thinking. "It's your bright idea," said one of the girls. "So you pry open the hand and you read that stupid note. We're not touching anything that's dead." So the boy took the dare. He walked right up to that severed arm, kneeled down, and started prying open the fingers on its cold, stiff hand. When he got them open wide enough, he jerked out the piece of paper. Everybody just stood there, wondering what mysterious secret was about to be revealed. He began unrolling the piece of paper. And finally, there in his hand, scribbled on this crumpled piece of paper, were these few words: "I ain't got no body." The story of the old farmer and the cursed bridle happened many years ago and is known by only a few people in this area. As the story goes, one night, right before the old farmer died, he burned his house and his stable down to the ground. And rumor has it, they both stood right here on this very campsite. Now, I will share with you the story of the old farmer and the cursed bridle. It seems there were these two friends who were driving across the country, taking on odd jobs as they went along. They passed this old farmhouse with a sign out front, "Help Wanted." So the boys stopped and went up to the house and knocked on the door. The door slowly squeaked open, and there before them stood an old gray-haired farmer. He told the boys he would be more than happy to hire them. He and his wife could always use a little extra help around the farm. Then he mumbled something about how the last two boys he hired didn't stick around for very long. And with that, he told the boys to take their bags and go on down to the old guest house. That work starts mighty early around here. So the two boys did what the old farmer said. And though neither one mentioned it, they both wondered why the last two boys left so quickly. After a few days on the job, one of the boys noticed that his buddy was starting to look kind of tired and was acting a little strange. He began to wonder what was wrong. So he decided to ask him that very question. And this is how his friend answered. "I've been having this terrible nightmare ever since we arrived here, waking up in a cold sweat, trembling, almost out of breath." Then he continued to explain his dream. "First, I hear this hypnotic, eerie whistling sound, like someone is calling me. Then I start walking through the woods, as if I were in some kind of a trance. The whistling keeps getting louder and louder and louder. And then she appears. And evil-looking old woman, all dressed in black. She motions for me to come closer. And when I do, she pulls an object out from behind her back. Without warning, she grabs my neck and pries open my jaw. I feel the taste of cold, hard metal in my mouth and a sharp, stabbing pain in my sides. My heart is beating a mile a minute. After that, all I can remember is waking up terrified and exhausted. Needless to say, his friend was a little concerned about this nightmare. So that night, he decided not to go to sleep and to stay awake so he could see for himself what was really going on. Well, just around midnight, it started. That hypnotic, eerie whistling sound. And suddenly, his friend rose out of his bed and began walking towards the woods. He yelled out for him to stop, but it didn't do any good. He just kept on walking. So he started following his friend, being very careful not to get too close. Soon, they reached a clearing in the woods. And there, in the moonlight, he saw her, the old woman. She was dressed all in black, just like his friend had described. And then, without warning, from behind her back, she took out an old horse's bridle, uttered some evil curse, and forced the bridle into his friend's mouth. There was a blinding flash of light, and when he looked up, there stood a horse, right where his friend had been standing just moments ago. The old witch jumped onto the horse's back, kicked her heels deep into the animal's sides, and rode off wildly into the night. The boy who witnessed all of this was so terrified, he ran all the way back to the house, jumped into his bed, and with his heart pounding like thunder, he just waited and hoped his friend would return. Finally, several hours later, just before dawn, his friend stumbled through the door, pale and completely exhausted. The two boys looked at each other and in complete terror decided it was time to leave this evil place. So they gathered their belongings and started for the door. When all at once they both stopped, as if to read each other's minds. "We can't leave here this way," they said. "We've got to teach this old witch a lesson, one she'll never forget." So they sat back down and came up with a master plan. The next night, just like the night before, that hypnotic, eerie whistling sound began. But this time, they were prepared. They had stuffed cotton in their ears to protect themselves from the old witch's hypnotic curse. So they creeped through the woods and circled behind the clearing where the witch was standing. Then sneaking up from behind. They both grabbed her. One held her, while the other stuck the bridle into her mouth and yelled the same curse he had heard her speak the night before. And with that came the blinding flash of light. And when the boys looked up, there stood a horse where the witch had stood just moments before. But you see, the story doesn't end here. Oh no. These two boys had one more important part of their plan to carry out. They led the old nag down the road, back to the stable, and they took her inside and tied her up to the stall. Then they took down a hammer and they nailed horseshoes to all four hooves of that old witch horse. The horse began whining and shaking her head from side to side, trying hard to break free. Well, the boys didn't wait around to see what happened next. They grabbed their bags and jumped into their car and drove away as fast as they could, leaving a trail of dust behind them. The old farmer was still in bed when he heard that blood-curdling scream. He somehow knew the scream was coming from the stable, and that scream was unlike any sound he had ever heard before. It was like a horse's cry, turning into the sound of a woman screaming. He ran to the stable and flung open the door. And there, on the stable floor, lay the cursed bridle. And over in the far corner, in a pool of blood, lay the farmer's wife, writhing in agony, with horseshoes nailed to her hands and feet. It's been said that if you're ever walking through the woods at night and you walk through a pocket of warm air, you just walked through a ghost. But the most important thing to remember is, if you're ever being chased by a ghost, the quickest way to safety is to run over a bridge, because a ghost cannot walk over water. One summer night, a group of young campers gathered their fishing gear and headed down to the camp lake. This was their favorite nighttime activity, and they always had good luck fishing off the end of the pier. The older campers used to always try and scare them. They'd say, "You better watch out fishing down there. That old pier is haunted. There's a strange ghost that's been roaming around that pier for a long time." But the boys figured they were just trying to scare them away from a good fishing spot. That night, they would learn the truth. There was a light mist in the air that night, and for some reason, the boys felt a little uneasy. As usual, they were all fishing at the end of the pier, which was about 50 feet or so from the shore, when they began to wonder why the fish weren't biting. It was then they noticed the frogs and the crickets had all grown quiet. The boys looked at each other and slowly turned around to see what had caused this silence. At first, they thought it was the older campers trying to play some kind of trick on them. But they soon realized that what they saw was no trick. There was a strange white light floating through the mist. It was coming from out of the woods, and it seemed to be headed right towards the pier. If they had run at that very moment, maybe nothing would have happened. But as it was, they just stood there, mesmerized by this strange floating light. Now the wind had begun blowing, and the boys could hear its ominous moaning sound as it blew across the water. But then they noticed the water was as smooth as glass. The moaning sound was coming from this strange white light. It had moved closer now and was about to reach the pier, when suddenly the boys realized this strange light was beginning to take the form of a woman. They could now see that she was wearing a long, white, tattered gown, and that her hair looked ragged and tangled as it hung down over her shoulders. But in the darkness and through the mist, it was still impossible to see who the woman was. As she began to take her first step onto the pier, the boys' hearts became filled with fear. And then, for no apparent reason, she stopped. It looked as though she was unable to walk on the pier, as if for some reason she feared the water. For a brief moment, the boys felt safe. But then, they realized she was standing between them and their only way back to the cabin. There was only one choice to be made. They had to walk closer, and they had to find out what it was this strange ghost woman wanted. So they slowly started walking down the pier. And as they got closer and closer, they began to make out the woman's face, or at least what was left of it. She looked as though she had risen from the grave. Her skin was dry and cracking, and it was sinking into her face. You could see her bones and her brown, rotting teeth. But worst of all, there were only black, empty sockets where her eyes had once been. Only one of the boys had enough nerve to speak, and all he could say was, Who are you?" And with that, the woman's head jerked around and stared right down into the boy's eyes. Her arms began flailing madly over her head, and then, quick as a snake, she grabbed him. His shirt started smoking, and he could feel a deep, burning pain in his arm. She began lifting him up off the pier and started jerking him from side to side. The evil ghost was screaming in anger as the boy was screaming in fear. And then, as quickly as she grabbed him, she let him go. Well, in all the fear and confusion, one of the boys had fallen backwards over the rail and into the water. So the boy, whose arm was still burning, jumped down and reached out his hand. He had to help his friend, who was now splashing in the dark waters. As he began to pull him back onto the pier, he suddenly felt the burning pain again. But this time, it was in his leg. The evil ghost had grabbed him by the leg and was trying to drag him off the pier. Now the pain was getting worse and worse, and the boy knew he had to do something, and he had to do it quick. So with all the strength he could muster, he gave a hard jerk with his leg. And with that, the evil ghost came tumbling onto the pier and over the rail and into the lake. For a moment, she lay there motionless, just floating on top of the water. Then slowly, all the water around her began bubbling. It looked like it was getting hotter and hotter. And then it started to boil. Her gown, her hair, her bones burst into flames. She started screaming like the dying ghost of some old evil spirit. Then the water all around the flames began to turn into a murky yellow, as if this tortured ghost was beginning to melt. The fire raged on for a few more moments, then slowly began to die down. As the boys leaned over the rail and looked down into the dark, yellow-stained waters, all they could see was the ghost woman's head, staring up at them as it slowly sank to the bottom of the lake. You know, sometimes I wonder what that evil, tortured ghost really wanted. And if she really did disappear that night beneath those dark, murky waters. Or did she just move on to haunt some other pier on some other night at some other camp? When the night falls, and you find yourself with your friends gathered around a nice crackling campfire, there are two things you must always try to remember. One, don't keep your back turned to the darkness for very long, for you never know what's lurking out there in the shadows. And two, but most importantly, watch out for the bats. for they will circle above, and then, without warning, they will swoop down, and with their long, sharp teeth, they will bite you. You see, the bat just does not like people. And you will understand why after you hear the rest of this story. Once, a long time ago, back in the beginning of the animal kingdom, there was a battle that raged between the four-legged creatures and the winged creatures, each wanting to rule the earth. The battle raged on for months and months, until finally the four-legged creatures won. Now the old bat, who had been living with the winged creatures, was very conniving and only wanted to be on the winning side. So he went to the four-legged creatures and said,
"Look, I deserve to be on your side. I've got fur just like you, and I've got long, sharp teeth just like you."
So the four-legged creatures accepted him as one of their own. But the battle was not over. The winged creatures refused to accept defeat. They continued to wage war. And finally, after many hard battles, they defeated the four-legged creatures. So now the old conniving bat returned to the winged creatures and said,
"Look, I deserve to be back on your side. I've got wings just like you, and I can fly just like you."
So the winged creatures accepted him back as one of their own. Now, as time passed, the battles continued to rage, neither side gaining ground. So they decided to call a truce and to ask man to make the ruling. Who was stronger, the four-legged creatures or the winged creatures? Well, man pondered his decision and came to the conclusion that both sides would be equal and both would share the earth. But because of the bat's deceitful desire to only be on the winning side, man decided that the bat would be banished from all kingdoms. And from this day forth, he must always sleep during the day, hanging upside down by his feet in a cold, dark cave. And he may never again fly by the light of day. He may only fly in the darkness of the night. So, for this very reason, the bat has grown to hate people. And with every chance he gets, he'll swoop down, and with his long, sharp teeth, he will bite you. Look out! Here they come! Up there! In the darkness!